Welcome everyone, you're watching another episode of Conversations with Alanki. Now, Sri Lanka has had several bad years. The Easter attacks in 2019, and then COVID and the lockdowns, the Aragale political turmoil, and the worst economic crisis since its independence, which has taken a toll on all Sri Lankans and changed their lives drastically. Where do we stand now in terms of the economy of Sri Lanka, and have we made any real progress, and what do we need to know? So to find out all of this today, I will be in conversation with Gregory Smith. He's the lead economist at the World Bank. Welcome.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for being a part of this conversation. Firstly, I think a key area of concern for all Sri Lankans currently is the economy of Sri Lanka, which has affected everyone. And when we speak of the IMF, Sri Lanka has been to the IMF 17 times. I do understand that Sri Lanka is faced with a dire situation and we do need to go to the IMF given the current circumstances. But how sustainable is this? What is the real cost of borrowing?
That's a great question. And Sri Lanka indeed has been to the IMF so many times. Although most of the programs historically were quite small, you've had two ginormous IMF programs, one in 2009 in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, and the current one that started in 2022 after the really deep, horrific crisis experienced here. So with these programs, you tend to only need such large financed IMF programs if you're in deep trouble, basically. And the IMF will come to your rescue. It's like they're called the lender of last resort when you can't borrow any more from international markets, when your banks have dried up, and from whether people see too much risk, and so you turn to the IMF, and it's not an easy process. It's really hard, and the IMF come to you with tough conditions, but they lend you money, and to date under this IMF program, $2 billion have flowed from the IMF coffers to Sri Lankan coffers to help build the reserves needed to allow for a recovery of the economy. And this money doesn't come cheap. It's expensive to borrow from the IMF. And as I said, you've got all these important conditions. But the positive side is that the economy is starting to bounce back from the depths of 2022 and 2023. And some of the reforms the IMF have put in their program are going to yield fantastic results.
Right. But can borrowing, not just from the IMF, but can borrowing in general lead to a debt trap? And what are the consequences of borrowing?
I think there's different types of borrowing. Borrowing for an individual or a country or a company can be fantastic if you borrow that money, invest in a new office premises or factory, and then you make a lot of profit and you pay that money back. And that's when borrowing makes sense. And same for a country. If you're borrowing money, you're building infrastructure, you're equipping your workforce with the skills needed in the future, then that pays a dividend in terms of future economic growth and higher revenue, and the borrowing's fine. Borrowing is just difficult and causes problems when there isn't a close link between what you borrow for and what you use that money for, and when simply you borrow too much. And unfortunately, while Sri Lanka grew incredibly well between, say, 2007 and 2017, over that decade, you averaged 6% growth, which is nearly a doubling of the size of the economy. And that's wonderful, post-conflict, building people's confidence, lots of investment. But at the same time, the government just overstepped and borrowed a little bit too much, so that when the shocks came that you mentioned in 2018, 19, and through the pandemic, the debt burden was so large, the country tripped up.
All right. We did speak about the shocks that Sri Lanka faced. So we had the Easter attacks in 2019, COVID, and the political crisis. In your view, were these the main issues that led to the economic crisis, or were there deep underlying issues and structural problems that need resolving?
Mm-hmm. So whenever I look at a crisis, there's quite often a vulnerability and a trigger. And I think that there's these shocks were tough on the economy, and the terrorist attacks caused a big dent in tourism, as did the pandemic, and the lockdowns were crippling for people, for businesses. So these are real shocks. But that said, there were clear vulnerabilities as well. And Sri Lanka suffered a much deeper crisis than many other countries, even in the region, which suggests these vulnerabilities were real. And some of these were linked to the overborrowing, borrowing too much over that decade, and a lack of progress with reforms, so much so that before even the pandemic had struck us in, when was it, March 2020, revenue had already collapsed in this country. The government was already struggling to function because its total revenue had collapsed to very low levels. Sri Lanka's traditionally collected less tax than other countries in the region, but things got critically low in 2019. So as Sri Lanka went into the pandemic crisis, it suffered more than other countries because it had these clear vulnerabilities. And you can define these as perhaps governance reforms is often labelled too, just the sort of quality of government, but also some bias in the way the growth and the strategy is executed, in that sometimes it feels to me there's a lack of promotion for investment. There's an anti-export bias. There's not enough helping companies, factories, people get business together to compete in global markets. And I think lastly, one of the key data points I look at is a lack of foreign investment in the run-up to the crisis, which other countries in East and South Asia have done much better on. So hopefully that's something that can be tackled in the years ahead.
So how can Sri Lanka get the right form of investments, especially foreign direct investments? Are we not getting sufficient investments because of inefficiencies within the system?
I think some investment is coming from loads of bright Sri Lankans working all over the world. So remittances have been a real success. And that's a wonderful flow of foreign exchange back from the Gulf, back from Australia, back from England, America, wherever. And that's Sri Lankans succeeding and doing well overseas. There's part tragedy to that, because one would prefer people to be working here and giving the private sector a boost, working in businesses, working in healthcare, and putting their skills to work in this country. On the other side, in terms of foreign investment, that's foreign firms coming, building their factories, setting up shop here and employing Sri Lankans. We haven't had the same record. And over that 10 years I talked about, even when the country was growing, foreign investment was incredibly low. And the truth is, you've got to do a lot of work to compete for foreign investment. You're competing with other countries who are trying incredibly hard. And it strikes me that Sri Lanka wasn't offering the right things to foreign investors, so they picked other destinations.
And what would you suggest? What necessary reforms to achieve sustainable and economic growth?
I think a lot of the things the government has put on the table in the last 2 years are spot on and are really putting us in the right direction. The tricky part is, they've done a hard part already, which is getting legislation passed, coming up with ideas and strategies, economic transformation bills. But after that hard part, there's another, perhaps even harder part, which is implementing that reform. And in my studies of the country, I find countless strategies for SOE reform, privatization, for investment promotion over the years. But these strategies often sort of rest on shelves and gather dust, and they're not fully implemented. So I think the right ideas are out there. They need debate and they need scrutiny from different parts of the Sri Lankan ecosystem, so people are happy with the reforms. But then they need someone to actually drive them home and make sure that that piece of legislation becomes real change.
You did say that Sri Lanka was on the right direction. And Sri Lanka is going to face an election this year. And assuming a new government comes in place, what should a new government do to ensure that the progress made so far will be carried forward?
I think for any new government, you want to come in and you want to change the world, or even an existing government coming back, you have all this ambition. But the trouble is that there's a reality. And that reality is that this recovery of the economy, it's been growing now for several quarters, is quite fragile, and people haven't really felt money in their pockets. And I often think about a nurse whose income is down 27% over the last few years in real terms, in purchasing power. So, your public transport's more expensive to work, your food's more expensive. And I just wonder, how that's not a recovery yet for people like that. So the idea that we're out of the woods is clearly not true. So whatever you want to do, you need to respect that this stability has been hard won and it needs to be secured and cemented. Because if we go back to inflation at double digits, I think there will be outcry. I think people aren't ready to experience that discomfort again. So I think the reality for anyone who's in power at the end and going into this year and going into next year is that they've got to cement these reforms, but also create a little bit of growth. So people feel and buy into the reforms, so that people don't get tired of all this change. And what people need is for the economy to improve, and that's going to take a little while. You know, we've done a few quarters, but what we really needed is a few years of growth for people to win back some of their lost earnings and purchasing power, and to feel a little bit more comfortable about investing again.
And while, I mean, I do understand that taxes are necessary to raise revenue, but the tax base in Sri Lanka is, however, very low. Are there any alternatives to taxing people at this rate, given that people's incomes are low and they're burdened by the rising cost of living?
Yeah, it's really hard, and you can measure revenue, government revenue or tax as a proportion of the economy. And what happened in 2019 and 20, it fell to a historic low. So that's rather like an elastic band for me. When you stretch it back, it can bounce. So we've gone from, I think, 7 or 8% of GDP, 7 or 8% of the economy, back to 11 or 12%. So to me, that move is doable. And it, you know, some of it was easy. It was just a sort of normalization. But the next steps are incredibly hard. You know, and I think if you really want to have more revenue, you've got to give the economy a boost. I think it's only through growth that revenue increases in a meaningful way. And I think the other side of it is about fairness. And I find things to be incredibly expensive in this country because of taxation, particularly imported goods when I compare it to other places I travel. So tax rates can be incredibly hard. You look at the price of secondhand vehicles and they're absolutely extortionate on anyone's standards. So you wonder why this is. And I think part of the reason the revenue is so low despite these high rates is a lot of people get exemptions. So you kind of need some fairness in a tax system for people to buy in. You need to feel that if you're paying and someone else isn't, that makes you angry. There needs to be a sense of fairness so everyone pays the same amount. And equally, you want to see that money spent well. You don't want to be seeing it wasted on state-owned companies that make a loss. You want to see that fed into an effective school system, good healthcare, decent infrastructure. And that's what you want. So as I said, I think we bounce back to normal levels of Sri Lanka. But if the next steps are made, you kind of need a better contract between people and the way the money's spent, with less corruption, with more efficiency. So people are happy to buy into this slightly larger state.
Right. How would you rate Sri Lanka's situation right now? Do you think Sri Lanka can grow at a better pace?
The forecasts aren't great, but I think they can. I think the country can. I see a huge amount of potential and skill here, which really makes me happy in numerous sectors. I'm upset when I hear about people leaving overseas for opportunities, but one hopes that will come to a halt and people can even be attracted back. And I think there's a really impressive ingenuity. And, you know, the fact that if you look in North America, some of the best performing minorities are Sri Lankan. It just says what people can do in a productive environment. So what I'd like to see here is a reduction in the red tape and to help a young entrepreneur start a business, and so that they spend their days and energy not chasing 5 permits over 3.5 weeks, but they're putting thoughts about how does our business get bigger? How can we sell to a booming Indian economy? How can we tap into global supply chains? And I think once entrepreneurs have that chance, then I think this country will thrive. And what I call that is like a creative growth. And I think at the moment what we've got a growth is no mistakes. We've just stopped the mistakes and we haven't had a shock in a little while, so we're growing. But the next steps to me are to be a passenger on India's rapid growth, on Bangladesh's rapid growth, and be part of a new South Asia that's generating income in a very swift way. But then to take a step forward, I said, and be creative and sort of put a Sri Lankan print on growth, where this country is creating goods and services. And as I said, we've got the skills here quite clearly, but we just need an environment where a small business or an entrepreneur can thrive.
You did talk now about Bangladesh and India growing at a rapid pace, but Sri Lanka hasn't. in your views, what is the reason for this? Where did we go wrong?
Sri Lanka managed it, as I said, 2007 to 17, 6% average, which is kind of where India is, give or take. And the difference is for India, they've just managed it over several decades. And the key thing is that they haven't had a big macroeconomic crisis. And that's what 2022 was, a meltdown. And what you have is you have 10 years of growth, then you have 5 years of drought, of where the economy really suffers, and you reverse those gains. But India's managed to sort of avoid those big macro mistakes. And that's partly in the past, when they had their big macro crisis in the early 90s, they decided as a country, we can't do this. We can't go through this again. It's too much. Let's, and people from all different walks of life, from different political parties decided, okay, the economy is sacrosanct. We don't mess with inflation. We don't mess with the fiscal deficits. We create the economy. The macro is a platform for the economy to run. And this country has that same choice. Do we see the IMF program through and cement that stability, or do we go through another cycle of boom and bust?
When we talk about the IMF, I've had conversations with several representatives of different political parties who say that they wish to renegotiate the terms of the IMF. And most politicals say they want to renegotiate the terms and they do not want to accept all the terms and conditions imposed by the IMF. But is this possible?
It's a great question, and if you're voted in, you lead the country in the policy direction, and an IMF program was signed by potentially a different government, assuming it changes. In those situations, it's really tricky. But I think a lot of the IMF policies were built on years of thinking in Sri Lanka, from bright Sri Lankan academics, from experts. And a lot of the policies make sense. So it's a difficult one, because some of the forecasts were made in the depths of 2022, when things were quite uncertain, and things have changed and got better. So really in 2022, we were desperate for stability. Now we're talking about how do we grow and build on this stability. So it has changed. So I think there's room for sort of augmenting the IMF program, for adding some growth features, for looking at some of the forecast. But on the whole, I think it's pretty good. So I think I think some things can be discussed at the margin, but for the most part, I think Sri Lankans want this stability to continue. And I think if any government changed things so much so that inflation went back to 10, 20, 30%, quite quickly there'd be protests again. So I think on the whole, the IMF program is good, but I'm really happy that people are thinking about it and investigating it and looking at what it entails and what they might add to it. I think that's a wonderful situation to be in.
All right. And what are your views on Sri Lanka being one of the most protected economies in the world? Do you think it has contributed to its bankruptcy?
It has, yes. So one of the bankruptcy, if we call that, we weren't able to pay, the country wasn't able to pay external debt in dollars. It ran out of foreign exchange and it was earning well from remittances. But as the economy grew over that decade I talked about, the contribution of exports fell, right? Which says that we're growing as an economy, but we're not competing overseas that well. We haven't replaced our traditional exports with more and better. So basically, without those foreign exchange inflows, you have a mismatch. And so what happened was, for a long time, the exchange rate was quite steady and people were importing a lot. And then suddenly we had a little bit of a wobble in 2018 when the rupee moved, and again in 2022. And overnight, those imports became unaffordable. So much so government struggled to pay medicine at some point. So what happened is you're kind of exposed to having a large foreign debt in dollars, and you're exposed to having a large import bill. And quite simply, there weren't the inflows to meet it. So care's needed that as the economy sort of gets back off its knees, that there's work done to encourage competitiveness and exports so that we get that foreign investment and Sri Lankan companies can sell abroad and earn foreign exchange to sort of balance the government's payments and avoid a similar crisis in future.
And how has the World Bank partnered with Sri Lanka to create a meaningful impact and to assist Sri Lanka navigate through these challenging times?
So we're a bank, so we provided very concessional money through the crisis. So when you borrow from the Eurobond market or other sources, you might pay 7 or 8%, and the money's paid back in 5 or 10 years. We've sort of provided concessional loans that are paid back over 30 years at a much lower cost. So we help the government switch from expensive financing to longer, calmer and lower cost financing. So that's been really important. We've also helped the government with requests. Sometimes with all these laws, it's been, we need support with translation, we need support with communications, we need support with reviewing this bill. So we've on demand, we've done our best to help the government whenever they've asked. And we've also done a lot of technical assistance. So whether it's on the new debt management law, whether it's on public financial management, whether it's on procurement, whether it's on healthcare, we've tried to engage and help government. But one of the things I'm really proud of is the way sort of the World Bank's changing from sort of trying to do everything itself to also engaging more with local partners. And from the time I've been here, I think I've learned a huge amount from Sri Lankan think tanks and engaging with them and working together on pieces of work. And that's just been wonderful. And I've learned a huge amount. And I think when I see the sort of the intelligence, the capacity, the knowledge of these local actors, that's a real positive for this country that can help influence the government's policies and improve them.
All right, shifting to a different topic, a broader topic. When we look at geopolitics, this is an election year. Mm-hmm. There are elections happening across many countries and many democracies. What significant developments can we expect in the next year or so, also given the fact that the world is recovering from the effects of the pandemic and lockdowns?
Yeah, it's going to be incredibly tough, and there's a lot of geopolitics at the moment. Whether it's China-India relations, whether it's America-China relations, we've got the war still in Ukraine and Russia. We've got the devastation of Gaza. We've got all these problems, and some of these impact Sri Lanka indirectly, and some of them more directly. For example, the cost of oil has gone up $10 a barrel, and as an oil importer, that makes things more expensive in this country. And so you've got those impacts, and then it's sort of openness to trade. And I think over the last 10, 20 years, there's been this openness to global supply chains, people setting up businesses everywhere, moving things around. But that becomes slightly harder when politicians are arguing we need to do more things at home and we need to import less. And so when those doctrines take over, it makes global trade tougher. And for a country like Sri Lanka that's sort of desperate to increase its exports, it will be all the more challenging. So but a lot of these things, it's not like geopolitics are new. This country's navigated them well for decades. So I guess I think the country can still thrive in that environment. But I think the biggest challenge is on the domestic front here to secure some solid policies and recovery to the economy.
And moving on to my final question, what do you think Sri Lanka should do differently in terms of bringing about economic recovery and growth, and to ensure that we do not fall as much as we did ever again?
I think for me, it's allowing a bit of space to create small businesses, entrepreneurship, to sort of, we've got the idea, that can you secure a job in government where you get a salary and a decent pension, but it's a big, 1.4 million people employed in the government in a small country, many of which are on extremely low pay. But what can we do to give those people opportunities in the private sector, for people who are struggling to set up their own business, to turn a small business of 3 or 4 employees into a large firm? And I think that's where the focus needs to be, in terms of removing that red tape and really encouraging people to be creative. I think would be absolutely wonderful. And when you have that creative engine of growth and allowing people to have ideas, that I think Sri Lankan services can compete in the region, they can compete overseas. Sri Lankan textiles, Sri Lankan tourism. There's so much opportunity that at the moment feels rather held back to me. And I think if we can work out ways to sort of, so that young person can thrive entrepreneurially, I think the success will be theirs. They've got the intelligence. They just need that opportunity.
And yes, you did just mention that Sri Lanka could depend on tourism. Do you think I mean, over the past few years, we've been depending on tourism. Do you think we can look beyond tourism?
Absolutely. I think tourism's still got massive space to grow. It's a huge success, but the location is wonderful for tourism. This beautiful geography, but it's also a great location in the middle of the Indian Ocean, of global freight passing through here. And just looking across the strait, we've got a country of 1.4 billion people that growing at 6%. And in the last 4 or 5 years, Sri Lanka the economy's been beaten up thoroughly, while India's economy grew about 8 Sri Lankas in that time. So the scale of your neighbor, and people I talk to Sri Lankans, and they always tell me, I've heard about this before, but the worry is to me that the East Asian economies have passed us by and done incredibly well in their development. But I think Sri Lanka has a real opportunity to sort of to solve some of its issues by sort of latching on to a lot of South Asia's progress, which really is the engine for global growth at the moment. So we're in a really exciting location. So whether we're talking about finance, insurance, banking, offshore for India and other large economies, whether we're talking about transshipment, whether we're talking about entering global value chains in turning agriculture goods into high-end food, whether we're talking modern ag, all of these are fantastic ideas. I think the tricky part is the implementation. So going back to my point earlier, I think all the ideas are there. We just need to continue the reforms and ensure that some of this legislation and big sort of reams of paper, if you like, get turned into real things on the ground.
Indeed. Thank you very much for this conversation and for your time. It was a comprehensive discussion, and thanks for taking the time to shed light on this important topic. So I was in conversation with Gregory Smith, the lead economist of the World Bank. Thank you everyone for watching. Do like, comment, subscribe, and share this video if you like it and if you find it insightful. I'll be back with another episode. Until then, stay safe and take care.